The manila envelope slipped from Sarah Chen's trembling fingers, scattering legal documents across the mahogany conference table like autumn leaves caught in an unexpected wind. Across from her, three men in charcoal suits watched with the patient intensity of vultures, their Mont Blanc pens poised above contracts that would change everything. The youngest lawyer cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. "Ms. Chen, we need your signature on the final transfer documents," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a transaction that had taken 18 months to orchestrate. "The Meridian Holdings acquisition of the Riverside Commons property portfolio is scheduled to close in exactly—" He glanced at his Rolex, the gold catching the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. 47 minutes. Sarah's eyes traveled to the window, where Seattle's skyline stretched before her like a concrete and steel manifestation of her deepest ambitions. Somewhere in that urban maze, her father was probably finishing his lunch at the corner deli near his apartment, the same apartment he'd rented for the past 3 years after the divorce settlement left him scrambling for affordable housing. The irony wasn't lost on her. In less than an hour, she would own 17 properties across 3 states, including the very building where Robert Chen hung his hat each night, never knowing his monthly rent checks were funding her daughter's empire. The phone in her purse buzzed with a text message, and Sarah's stomach clenched as she recognized the number. Dad. She didn't need to look to know what it said. Probably another passive-aggressive comment about her unrealistic dreams, or a reminder that women like her didn't belong in real estate. The same words he'd been drilling into her head since she was 16, standing in the kitchen of their old house in Bellevue, announcing her intention to study business and finance. "Real estate is a man's game, Sasha," he'd said then, using the childhood nickname that once felt like honey on her tongue, but now tasted bitter as overbrewed coffee. "Real estate, that's for people with connections, with family money. We came here with nothing, and that's what girls like you start with. Nothing." Margaret Webb, Sarah's business mentor, and the woman responsible for introducing her to the Riverside Commons opportunity, leaned forward from her seat at the head of the table. At 63, Margaret possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from 4 decades of closing deals in boardrooms where she was often the only woman present. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her navy Armani suit spoke of old money and older wisdom. "Take your time, dear," Margaret said, her voice carrying the faint trace of a Boston accent that Harvard Business School hadn't quite polished away. The understanding in Margaret's eyes made Sarah's chest tight with emotion. Margaret knew the whole story, knew about the late nights spent studying financial modeling while working 3 part-time jobs, knew about the rejections from male investors who dismissed her business plans with condescending smiles, knew about the father who'd made his disapproval of her career choice a central theme of every family gathering for the past 8 years. Sarah picked up the Mont Blanc pen, its weight substantial and reassuring in her palm. The documents before her represented the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan that had begun 3 years ago when she discovered her father's new address during a routine property search. Riverside Commons, a modest apartment complex in the University District, had been hemorrhaging money under its previous owners, a family trust that had inherited the property but lacked the vision or resources to properly maintain it. She'd spent 6 months researching the building's history, analyzing rent rolls, studying the neighborhood's demographic trends, and mapping out a comprehensive renovation plan that would transform the aging complex into a sustainable, profitable investment. The numbers had been beautiful in their simplicity. Purchase price of $2.8 million, renovation budget of $800,000, projected annual rental income of $420,000 after improvements. But the real beauty of the deal lay in its psychological symmetry. Her father, Robert Chen, lived in Unit 4B, paying $1,200 per month for a 1-bedroom apartment he'd chosen specifically for its affordability. He'd moved there during his divorce proceedings when his construction business was struggling and his pride was at its lowest ebb. Sarah remembered the phone call where he'd grudgingly announced his new address, his voice carrying the shame of a man who'd spent his entire adult life preaching about the importance of homeownership, only to find himself back in rental housing at age 58.
The acquisition had been structured through a web of carefully crafted legal entities designed to maintain her anonymity. Meridian Holdings, LLC, was registered to a P.O. box in Delaware, with Margaret Webb listed as the managing member. The property management company, Pacific Northwest Residential Services, handled all tenant communications and maintenance requests. On paper, Sarah Chen didn't exist in the ownership structure, just another invisible layer in the complex architecture of American capitalism. Her phone buzzed again, and this time Sarah couldn't resist glancing at the screen. The message was exactly what she'd expected. Had lunch with Jerry today. His daughter just got promoted to senior analyst at Goldman Sachs. Real career, real money. When are you going to stop playing around with this real estate nonsense and find a serious job? The familiar sting of his words mixed with something else. A dark satisfaction that felt both foreign and intoxicating. Soon, very soon, she would have the perfect response to his constant criticism. Not through argument or explanation, but through revelation. The truth had a weight that words could never match. The seller's representatives are waiting in conference room B, the eldest lawyer announced, consulting his phone. Mrs. Patterson from the Morrison Family Trust is ready to execute the final documents. Sarah nodded, her mind flashing back to the first time she'd met Eleanor Patterson, the 74-year-old matriarch who'd inherited Riverside Commons from her late husband. Eleanor had been skeptical of Sarah initially, questioning whether someone so young could handle such a significant investment. But Sarah's business plan had been flawless. Her financing secured, her references impeccable. Margaret's endorsement had carried the final weight needed to tip the scales in her favor. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that she was particularly impressed by your commitment to maintaining affordable housing in the neighborhood. She said it reminded her of her late husband's philosophy about real estate investment, that property ownership comes with social responsibility. The comment triggered a memory Sarah had tried to forget, a conversation with her father from 2 years ago when she'd attempted to explain her investment philosophy. She'd been excited about a potential development project in Tacoma, a rundown strip mall that could be transformed into mixed-use housing for young families and seniors. Her father had listened with his arms crossed, his expression growing more skeptical with each detail she shared. "You think you're going to change the world with real estate?" he'd scoffed. "Property development is about profit, Sasha. Don't fool yourself into thinking it's about helping people. The sooner you understand that business is business, the better off you'll be. But honestly, I still think you should consider something more appropriate for someone with your background." The word appropriate hung between them like a blade. Sarah knew where he meant. Appropriate for a woman, appropriate for the daughter of immigrants, appropriate for someone without connections or inherited wealth. His vision of her future was small and safe, bounded by his own fears and limitations. Now, sitting in this conference room with documents that would make her one of the youngest commercial property owners in the Pacific Northwest, Sarah felt the weight of that old conversation pressing against her ribs. The irony was exquisite in its completeness. Her father, who'd spent years questioning her judgment and ambition, would soon be writing monthly rent checks to fund the expansion of her real estate portfolio.
Margaret reached across the table and touched Sarah's wrist gently. "I remember my first major acquisition," she said quietly. 1987, a small office building in Cambridge. I was so nervous I could barely hold the pen steady. But you know what I realized? The fear never really goes away. It just transforms into fuel. The words resonated in Sarah's chest like a tuning fork struck against crystal. Margaret had become more than a mentor over the past 3 years. She'd become the mother figure Sarah had never quite found in her own family. Where her parents had offered caution and limitation, Margaret had provided vision and possibility. Where her father saw risk and foolishness, Margaret saw calculated ambition and strategic thinking. "The fear is good," Margaret continued, her gray eyes reflecting the afternoon sunlight. "It means you understand the magnitude of what you're doing, but don't let it paralyze you. Some opportunities only knock once." Sarah lifted the pen and signed her name with a flourish that surprised her with its confidence. Sarah Chen, in her own handwriting, claiming ownership of 17 properties valued at just over $12 million.
The signature felt like drawing a line between her past and future, between the woman her father expected her to be and the woman she'd chosen to become. As the lawyers gathered the documents and began making copies, Sarah allowed herself a moment to imagine tomorrow morning. Her father would wake up in his apartment, make his coffee in the small kitchenette, and step out onto the balcony overlooking the courtyard where the new landscaping had just been completed. He'd probably notice the improvements, the fresh paint on the building's exterior, the upgraded lighting in the hallways, the new security system that required keycards for entry. What he wouldn't know, at least not yet, was that every improvement had been funded by his own rent payments, along with those of his 63 neighbors. The monthly checks he wrote with such reluctance, always accompanied by complaints about rising housing costs and corporate landlords, had been flowing directly into his daughter's investment accounts for the past 18 months. The young lawyer handed her a leather portfolio containing her copies of the transaction documents. "Congratulations, Miss Chen. You're now the proud owner of Riverside Commons along with the 16 other properties in the portfolio." Sarah accepted the portfolio with both hands, feeling the weight of it like a tangible representation of her achievement. Inside these folders lay the legal proof of everything she'd worked toward since graduating from the University of Washington with dual degrees in finance and real estate development. The same degrees her father initially refused to help pay for, insisting that education was wasted on girls who would just get married anyway. "There is one item that requires your immediate attention," the eldest lawyer said, consulting his notes. "The property management company has flagged several units for rent increases that were delayed pending the ownership transfer. The increases are all within legal limits and market rates, but they'll need to be implemented within the next 60 days to maintain your projected cash flow." Sarah's pulse quickened as she scanned the list of affected units. There, halfway down the page, was Unit 4B, her father's apartment. The proposed increase was modest, just $150 per month, bringing his rent from $1,200 to $1,350, still well below market rate for the area, especially considering the recent improvements to the property. "I'll review the rent adjustments and provide guidance to the property management company within the week," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The decision about her father's rent would require careful consideration. Too aggressive, and I might force him to relocate, ruining the elegant symmetry of the situation. Too lenient, and I'd be subsidizing his housing at the expense of my other investors. Margaret stood up from her chair, smoothing her skirt as she prepared to leave. "Sarah, I'm hosting a small celebration dinner tonight at the Columbia Tower Club. Just a few colleagues who've been following your progress. Would you like to join us?" The invitation was tempting, a chance to celebrate with people who understand the significance of what she'd accomplished, but Sarah felt the need for solitude, for time to process the magnitude of the day's events. "Thank you, but I think I need some time to let this all sink in."
Margaret nodded with understanding. "Of course, but don't let it sink in too long. Tomorrow, the real work begins. Property management, tenant relations, capital improvements. Owning real estate is just the beginning. Making it profitable and sustainable, that's where the real skill comes in." As the meeting dispersed and the lawyers packed their briefcases, Sarah remained seated at the conference table, staring out at the Seattle skyline with new eyes. Somewhere in that maze of buildings and streets, her 17 properties were generating income, housing families, contributing to the economic fabric of 3 different communities. She was no longer just Sarah Chen, the ambitious young woman with impractical dreams. She was Sarah Chen, real estate investor and property owner, with a portfolio that would be the envy of developers twice her age. Her phone buzzed with another message from her father. "By the way, rent is going up again next month. $13.50. These corporate landlords are bleeding working people dry. Anyway, what are you doing for dinner Sunday? Your mother wants to know." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, her finger hovering over the reply button. The temptation to reveal everything right now, through a text message, was almost overwhelming. The look on his face when he realized the truth would be worth all the years of doubt and dismissal he'd heaped on her dreams. But no, that wouldn't do justice to the moment she'd been planning for 3 years. The revelation deserved a stage worthy of its drama, a setting that would maximize its impact.
Sunday dinner, with her mother present as a witness, would be perfect. Her parents' small apartment, with its walls covered in photographs of the successful children of their friends, doctors, lawyers, engineers, would provide the ideal backdrop for her announcement. She typed back a simple response: "I'll be there. Can't wait to share some exciting news." Outside the conference room windows, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward Elliott Bay, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that reminded Sarah of the first time she'd driven past Riverside Commons and imagined its potential. That had been 3 years ago, when she was still working as a junior analyst at a commercial real estate firm, spending her lunch breaks driving through neighborhoods and dreaming of the day she'd have the capital to turn vision into reality. The portfolio in her hands contained more than legal documents. It held the blueprints for a future she'd designed herself, despite every voice that told her it was impossible. Tomorrow, she would begin the next phase of her plan, the careful orchestration of improvements and expansions that would transform her initial investment into a sustainable empire. But today, she allowed herself to savor the sweet taste of vindication, knowing that the best was yet to come. The conference room emptied around her, leaving Sarah alone with her triumph and the weight of what she'd chosen to keep secret. In 3 days, at Sunday dinner, the truth would finally emerge from the shadows where she had hidden it so carefully. Her father would learn that his monthly rent checks hadn't been disappearing into the coffers of some faceless corporation, but had instead been funding his daughter's rise to become exactly what he had always insisted she could never be: a successful property owner with the financial independence to chart her own course. The irony was delicious, complex, and perfect in its mathematical precision. Robert Chen, the man who'd spent years telling his daughter that real estate was beyond her reach, had unknowingly become the foundation upon which her empire was built. Sarah's alarm chimed at 5:30 a.m., the same time it had every weekday for the past 4 years. In the darkness of her Queen Anne apartment, she reached for her phone with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to maximize every minute of the day. The first text message was from her property manager, confirming that the new tenant applications for 2 vacant units at the Bellingham complex had been approved. The second was from her mother, sent at 4:45 a.m. Seattle time, which meant 7:45 a.m. in Chicago, where her parents were visiting her successful cousin David, the cardiothoracic surgeon. David just bought his 3rd house. Beautiful place in Lincoln Park. When are you going to settle down and buy something permanent? All this apartment renting makes your father worried you're not building real wealth. Sarah set the phone face down on her nightstand and stared at the ceiling, counting the familiar cracks in the plaster that she'd never bothered to repair. The irony of her mother's message was almost too perfect. Here she was, owning more real estate than anyone else in her extended family. While living in a modest 1-bedroom rental that cost her $1,800 per month. But the apartment served a purpose beyond mere shelter. It was part of her carefully constructed public persona, the version of Sarah Chen that her family and old college friends still believed in. The rental allowed her to maintain the fiction that she was still struggling to establish herself, still saving money for that elusive first home purchase, still working toward the stability that her parents valued above all else. If they knew the truth, that she could buy this entire building in cash and still have enough left over to acquire 2 more properties, it would shatter the narrative she'd spent 3 years perfecting. She padded to the kitchen in her pajamas, a ritual that grounded her before each day's performance began. The coffee maker, a simple black Cuisinart that had served her since graduate school, gurgled to life as she measured out the dark roast beans she bought in bulk from a wholesale supplier. Financial discipline had become second nature over the years, a muscle memory that extended to every aspect of her daily life. While the coffee brewed, Sarah opened her laptop and logged into her property management software, scanning overnight reports from her 17 buildings. A broken water heater in Portland, a noise complaint in Spokane, a request for pet approval at the Riverside Commons, the steady drumbeat of issues that required her attention before most people had even opened their eyes. The Riverside Commons report made her pause. Mrs. Henderson and 3C had submitted a maintenance request about a leaky faucet, and the timestamp showed it had come in at 11:47 p.m. the previous night. Sarah knew Mrs. Henderson from the tenant files. 72 years old, retired librarian, had been living in the building for 6 years. She was also one of her father's neighbors, someone he'd mentioned in passing during their phone conversations. "There's this sweet old lady who lives below me, brings me soup when I'm sick, always asking about you and your mother, reminds me of your grandmother. But she's struggling with the rent increases, all these corporate landlords squeezing people who can't afford it." The comment had stung more than Sarah cared to admit. Her father's sympathy for Mrs. Henderson was genuine, born from his own vulnerability as an aging tenant in a rental market that seemed increasingly hostile to people on fixed incomes. What he didn't know was that his daughter had specifically instructed the property management company to keep Mrs. Henderson's rent below market rate, a small gesture that cost Sarah roughly $300 per month in potential income. She made a note to have the maintenance team prioritize Mrs. Henderson's request, then moved on to the financial reports that would guide her day's decisions. Rental income across all properties was performing 3.2% above projections, with occupancy rates holding steady at 94%. The Tacoma property, her most recent acquisition before Riverside Commons, was finally showing the return she'd anticipated when she'd purchased it 18 months ago. But the numbers, satisfying as they were, couldn't quiet the voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like her father's. "Money isn't everything, Sasha," he'd say during their childhood conversations about her future. "Family, stability, doing work that helps people. That's what matters. All this focus on business and profit, it's not healthy for a young woman." The contradiction had always frustrated her. Her father worked 60-hour weeks in construction, building homes and commercial buildings that generated profits for other people, yet he seemed to view Sarah's entrepreneurial ambitions with deep suspicion. He respected hard work when it was performed for someone else, but questioned the same dedication when it was channeled toward building something of her own. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her morning review. Margaret Webb's name appeared on the screen, and Sarah smiled despite the early hour. Margaret was the only person in her life who knew the complete truth about her financial situation, the only witness to the transformation she'd undergone over the past 5 years. "Good morning, dear." Margaret's voice carried its usual warmth, tinged with the energy of someone who'd been awake for hours. "I wanted to check in after yesterday's closing. How are you feeling?" "Honestly, overwhelmed," Sarah admitted, settling into her favorite chair with her coffee mug. "It's one thing to plan for this moment, but actually owning 17 properties feels surreal."
Margaret's laugh was rich and knowing. "I remember that feeling. The first time I owned more real estate than I could personally manage, I spent 3 sleepless nights convinced I'd made a terrible mistake. But you know what I discovered? The fear means you're taking it seriously. The people who should be afraid are the ones who aren't." Through her apartment window, Sarah could see the early morning joggers beginning their routes around the neighborhood. Normal people with normal lives, she thought. People whose biggest financial stress was probably their monthly student loan payment or saving up for a vacation. She envied their simplicity, even as she knew she could never accept it for herself. "Margaret, can I ask you something personal?" Sarah said, watching a young couple walk their dog past her building. "Do you ever regret the sacrifices, the relationships that became complicated because of your success?" The pause that followed carried weight, suggesting this wasn't the first time Margaret had considered the question. "Regret is too strong a word," she said finally, "but there have been costs. Some people in my life couldn't handle my success. They saw it as a judgment on their own choices. Others tried to use our relationship for financial gain, and yes, there were men who were intimidated by my wealth, who needed to feel like the primary provider even when that wasn't practical." Sarah nodded, thinking about her own dating life over the past few years. She'd learned to be careful about revealing her financial situation, to let potential partners assume she was still working her way up the career ladder. The deception felt necessary but exhausting, creating a distance between her public self and private reality that sometimes felt unbridgeable. The question isn't whether there are costs. The question is whether the alternative would have been worse. Would you be happier if you'd followed your father's advice? Found a safe job, married young, let someone else make the big financial decisions? The answer came immediately, rising from a place deeper than conscious thought. No, absolutely not. Then you have your answer.
The path we've chosen isn't easy, but it's honest to who we are. And Sarah, Margaret's voice softened, what you've accomplished in 5 years typically takes people 15. You're not just successful, you're exceptional. Don't let anyone, family included, convince you otherwise. After ending the call, Sarah returned to her laptop and opened the folder containing her long-term strategic plan. The document, updated weekly for the past 2 years, outlined her goals for the next decade. Expand to 50 properties by age 35, diversify into commercial real estate, establish a property management company that could handle other investors' portfolios. Each goal was broken down into quarterly milestones, complete with financial projections and risk assessments. But beneath the spreadsheets and business plans lay a more personal motivation, one she'd never articulated to anyone, not even Margaret. Every property she acquired was a rebuke to her father's limitations, proof that the world he'd tried to box her into was smaller than the life she could create for herself. Each successful investment was a conversation she'd never have to have, an argument she'd already won through action rather than words. Her phone buzzed with a text from her college roommate, Jenny. "Coffee this afternoon? I have news about the wedding planning. Also, Mark's been asking about you again." Oh, groaned softly. Jenny was getting married in 6 months to her college boyfriend, a steady accountant who worked for the city and coached Little League on weekends. It was exactly the kind of stable and predictable relationship that Sarah's parents thought she should want. And Mark, Jenny's cousin, a software engineer who'd been expressing interest in Sarah for the better part of a year, represented everything her father considered appropriate for his daughter. She'd gone on 3 dates with Mark, pleasant evenings that felt like job interviews for the position of suitable boyfriend. He was kind, intelligent, financially responsible, and completely uninterested in discussing anything more ambitious than weekend hiking trips and retirement savings accounts. When she'd tried to share her excitement about a potential property acquisition in Bellingham, his response had been a lecture about the risks of real estate investment and the wisdom of index funds. "I just think you should be more careful," he'd said over dinner at a restaurant she could have bought with her monthly cash flow. "Real estate is so unpredictable. Wouldn't you rather have security?" The word security had buzzed between them like an insect she wanted to swat away. Security was what people chose when they were afraid of greatness, when they preferred the known limitations of their current circumstances to the uncertain possibilities of growth and expansion. Sarah typed back to Jenny, "Can't do coffee today. Property management crisis. Rain check?" It wasn't entirely a lie. There was always some crisis requiring attention across her portfolio, some decision that couldn't wait for a more convenient moment. But the truth was more complex. She was tired of performing the role of struggling young professional, tired of listening to her friends' advice about finding balance and settling down when her own life was accelerating at a pace they couldn't imagine. She opened her closet and selected her uniform for property management days. Dark jeans, a crisp white button-down, and a blazer that looked professional without being intimidating. The outfit was designed to help her blend in with contractors and tenants, to project competence without wealth. Most of her property visits were conducted through her management company, but she made a point of personally inspecting each building at least once per quarter. Today's schedule included a walkthrough at the Riverside Commons, where the new landscaping project had been completed ahead of schedule. Sarah had approved the upgrade package, new plants, improved lighting, a small seating area near the building's entrance, as part of her strategy to increase property values while maintaining affordability for existing tenants. The improvements would justify modest rent increases while enhancing the quality of life for residents like Mrs. Henderson and her father. As she drove toward the university district, Sarah practiced the conversation she'd been rehearsing for weeks. Sunday dinner at her parents' apartment was 3 days away, and she'd finally decided it was time to reveal the truth about her financial situation. Not all of it. That would be too much, too sudden. But enough to shift the dynamic that had defined their relationship for the past 8 years. She would start simply. Mention that she'd made some successful investments, that her financial situation was more stable than they'd realized. She'd let them assume it was stock market gains or cryptocurrency luck, something that wouldn't threaten their conception of appropriate careers for young women. Then, gradually, she'd reveal the scope of her real estate portfolio, The passive income that exceeded most people's full-time salaries, the financial independence that made their concerns about her future seem quaint and outdated. The fantasy of their reaction played out in her mind like a movie she'd watched 100 times. Her father's skepticism giving way to surprise, then pride. Her mother's worried questions about stability and security replaced by admiration for her daughter's business acumen. The family dynamics shifting as they realized she was no longer the struggling young woman who needed their financial advice and emotional protection. But beneath the fantasy lay a darker fear, that their love for her was conditional on her neediness, that her success might create a distance between them that couldn't be bridged by shared blood and childhood memories. Her father's criticism, as painful as it was, at least kept him engaged in her life. What if her independence made her irrelevant to him? Sarah pulled into the parking lot at Riverside Commons and sat in her car for a moment, studying the building where her father slept each night. From the outside, it looked like dozens of other apartment complexes built in the 1970s. 3 stories of beige brick, functional but uninspiring. But she knew its bones were solid, its location ideal for young professionals and graduate students. With the right improvements in marketing, it could become one of the most desirable residential properties in the university district. Her phone rang again, this time displaying her father's number. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out over caution. "Hi, Dad."
Sasha, I'm at work, but I wanted to ask you something. His voice carried the fatigue that had become more pronounced over the past few years, the weariness of a man approaching retirement without the financial security he'd hoped to achieve. Your mother's been talking to David's parents about their real estate investments. They bought some rental property in Chicago, made good money on it. Do you think that's something we should consider? The irony was so perfect that Sarah had to bite her lip to keep from laughing. Her father, who'd spent years dismissing her real estate ambitions, was now asking for her advice about property investment. The man who'd insisted that real estate was a man's game wanted guidance from the daughter he'd never taken seriously. Real estate can be a good investment, she said carefully, but it requires a lot of research and capital. What kind of property are you thinking about? I don't know, maybe a small apartment building? Something that could provide income in retirement? His voice carried the vulnerability of someone admitting he hadn't prepared as well as he should have for his golden years. The thing is, I don't really understand how any of it works. Numbers were never my strong suit. Sarah felt a surge of emotion that surprised her with its complexity. Compassion mixed with vindication, love tangled with frustration. Here was her father finally acknowledging that real estate investment required skills and knowledge, finally admitting that he might not have all the answers. But he still couldn't bring himself to ask for her help directly, couldn't quite overcome the gender assumptions that had shaped their relationship for so many years. It's complicated. There are a lot of factors to consider: location, property condition, rental market trends, financing options. Maybe we could talk about it more when I see you Sunday. Yeah, that would be good. You've always been smart about money, even if I haven't always understood your career choices. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither quite knew how to cross. Sarah felt the weight of all the conversations they'd never had, all the support she'd craved and been denied, all the validation that came too late to heal old wounds, but wasn't too late to matter. I'll do some research before Sunday, maybe put together some information about how real estate investing works. That would be great. And Sasha, I'm proud of you, even if I don't always show it the right way. After her father hung up, Sarah sat in her car for several more minutes, processing the unexpected turn their conversation had taken. The revelation she'd been planning for Sunday dinner had just become more complicated, more loaded with emotional significance than she'd anticipated. Her father wasn't just going to learn that she owned property, he was going to discover that she had already mastered the very thing he was hoping to learn about, that she'd been building the financial security he was still struggling to achieve.
She finally got out of her car and walked toward the building entrance, pulling out the master key that would give her access to common areas and maintenance rooms. The new landscaping looked even better in person than it had in the photographs her contractor had sent. The small Japanese maple trees would provide shade in summer, and the decorative lighting would make the entrance more welcoming for residents returning home after dark. As she inspected the improvements, Sarah caught her reflection in the building's glass doors. She looked like what she was, a successful young businesswoman conducting a property inspection. But she also looked like someone carrying secrets, someone whose public presentation didn't quite match the complexity of her private reality. In 3 days, some of those secrets would finally see daylight. Her father would learn that his monthly rent checks had been funding his daughter's empire, that the corporate landlord he'd been complaining about was actually his own child. The revelation would change everything between them, shifting the power of knowledge in ways that couldn't be undone. But first, she had work to do, properties to manage, tenants to serve, an empire to expand. The conversation with her father would have to wait until Sunday, when the time was right and the stage was set for the performance she'd been rehearsing for 3 years. The emergency call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday, jarring Sarah from the deep sleep she'd finally fallen into after spending hours analyzing potential acquisitions in Portland.
The management company's after-hours service never called unless it was truly urgent. Fire, flood, or something requiring immediate legal attention. She fumbled for her phone, her heart already racing with the possibilities of what might have gone wrong. Miss Chen, this is David from Emergency Property Services. We've got a situation at Riverside Commons. Water main break in the basement, flooding affecting 6 ground floor units. Fire department is on scene, but we're going to need to relocate tenants tonight. Sarah was already out of bed, pulling on clothes in the darkness. How bad is the damage? Are any residents injured? No injuries, but it's pretty significant water damage. Units 1A through 1F are uninhabitable, and we've had to shut off water to the entire building. The affected tenants are in the lobby right now, most of them elderly residents who don't have family they can call at this hour. Her mind raced through the implications. 6 units meant roughly 12 displaced residents, all of whom would need emergency housing while repairs were completed. Her insurance would cover the damages in temporary relocation costs, but the human impact would be immediate and traumatic. These weren't just numbers on a rent roll. They were neighbors, people whose lives she'd disrupted, even though the break was due to aging infrastructure that predated her ownership. "I'm on my way," she said, grabbing her keys and emergency property management folder. Book rooms at the University Inn for all displaced tenants. Full coverage for however long the repairs take. And David? Make sure Mrs. Henderson in 3C is okay. She's elderly and might need special assistance. 25 minutes later, Sarah stood in the lobby of Riverside Commons, surveying a scene that looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Elderly residents in bathrobes and hastily thrown-on clothes clustered around the seating area, some clutching small suitcases they'd managed to pack in the evacuation. The sound of industrial fans echoed from the basement, where emergency crews were working to pump out standing water. Mrs. Henderson was sitting in a corner chair, a thick winter coat pulled over her nightgown, looking smaller and more fragile than Sarah had imagined from her tenant file. Next to her sat a man Sarah recognized immediately from family photographs, her father, Robert Chen, wearing the same blue robe he'd had for 15 years and the slippers her mother had bought him last Christmas. The sight of him there, looking vulnerable and displaced in his own building, hit Sarah like a physical blow. This was her first time seeing him in person since the property acquisition, her first moment of witnessing the human cost of the secret she'd been keeping. He was talking quietly to Mrs. Henderson, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture of comfort that reminded Sarah of the father she'd known in childhood, before their relationship had become complicated by expectations and disappointments. Sarah pulled her baseball cap down lower and approached the property manager who was coordinating with the emergency responders. She'd learned years ago that anonymity was crucial in situations like this. Tenants needed to feel like their concerns were being heard by someone in authority, not dismissed by an owner who might seem more interested in protecting her investment than caring for their welfare. "What's the timeline for repairs?"
she asked quietly, keeping her voice low enough that her father wouldn't overhear. At least 2 weeks for the basement cleanup and infrastructure repair. Maybe longer, depending on what we find when we start pulling up flooring and checking the electrical systems. The good news is that the upper floors weren't affected, so we're only looking at 6 displaced families. Sarah nodded, her eyes drifting back to her father and Mrs. Henderson. In the fluorescent light of the lobby, her father looked older than she remembered, more tired. The construction work that had sustained him for 30 years was taking its toll on his body, and she could see it in the way he favored his left shoulder, the careful way he stood up from his chair. I want daily updates on the repair progress, and make sure the displaced tenants know that all their expenses are covered, not just the hotel rooms, but meals, transportation, anything they need. This isn't their fault, and they shouldn't suffer financially because of infrastructure problems.
The property manager looked surprised by her generosity. Most owners, in his experience, tried to minimize costs and push tenants toward the cheapest possible temporary arrangements. That's very generous. Should I set spending limits? Within reason, no. These people have been displaced from their homes. The least we can do is make sure they're comfortable while we fix the problem we inherited. As she spoke, Sarah noticed her father getting up from his chair, moving toward the group of residents who were discussing their temporary housing arrangements. Even in crisis, he was trying to help, trying to make sure the older residents understood what was happening and felt supported. It was classic Robert Chen behavior, putting others' needs ahead of his own comfort, stepping into a leadership role even when he had no official authority. "Excuse me," her father said to the property manager, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd spent decades managing construction crews. "Some of the folks here are worried about their medications and important documents that are still in their apartments. Is there any way we can escort them back to collect essentials?" Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting to see how the property manager would respond. She wanted to step in, to authorize whatever her father and the other tenants needed, but doing so would reveal her identity at the worst possible moment. "I understand the concern," the manager said carefully, "but the building inspector needs to clear the structure before we can allow anyone back inside. It should only be another hour or 2. Her father nodded, but Sarah could see the frustration in his posture. He was used to solving problems through direct action, not waiting for bureaucratic processes to unfold at their own pace. She recognized the same impatience in herself, the same need to take control when circumstances felt chaotic and uncertain. "In the meantime, maybe we could get some coffee going? And blankets for some of the older folks. Mrs. Henderson is starting to shiver, and Mr. Martinez forgot his heart medication." Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with guilt as she watched her father organizing care for his neighbors. This was the man who'd raised her to think about others, to take responsibility for her community. But it was also the same man who'd years spent undermining her confidence, who'd convinced her that her dreams were too big and her ambitions inappropriate. The property manager looked around helplessly. "I'm not sure where we'd get coffee at this hour. There's a 24-hour diner about 6 blocks away. I could make a run, bring back coffee and some breakfast for everyone," Sarah found herself saying, stepping forward before she could second-guess the impulse. Her father looked up at her with the automatic gratitude of someone accepting help from a stranger. For a moment, their eyes met across the lobby, and Sarah felt the surreal disorientation of being seen, but not recognized by the man who'd shaped so much of her life. "That's very kind of you," he said, his voice warm with the appreciation he'd always shown to people who went out of their way to help others. "I'm Robert Chen, by the way, Unit 4B. "Sarah," she replied, the truth slipping out before she could choose a false name. The lie felt heavy on her tongue, but it was easier to explain why a random young woman would care so much about the welfare of displaced tenants. She turned away quickly, afraid that prolonged eye contact might trigger some buried recognition, some parental instinct that would pierce through her disguise. As she walked to her car, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Saw the emergency call log. Everything under control?"
Margaret's property management company handled several buildings in Sarah's portfolio, and they'd established protocols for after-hours emergencies that kept Margaret informed. Significant incidents. Sarah appreciated the oversight. It was like having an experienced mentor available for consultation even in the middle of the night. Water main break at Riverside Commons, Sarah typed back. 6 units flooded, tenants displaced. Handling it personally. Personally? That's unusual for you. Everything okay? Sarah stared at the phone screen, trying to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal the emotional complexity of the situation. How could she explain that one of the displaced tenants was her father, that this emergency had forced her into the same physical space as the man she'd been keeping secrets from for 3 years? "Just want to make sure it's handled right," she finally replied. "These are good tenants, long-term residents. They deserve better than the minimum." Margaret's response came quickly. "Careful, dear. Emotional attachment to properties can cloud business judgment, but I trust your instincts." The diner was nearly empty at 3 a.m., staffed by a single waitress who looked like she'd been serving coffee to insomniacs and night shift workers for decades. Sarah ordered 12 large coffees, a box of assorted donuts, and breakfast sandwiches for anyone who might want them. The bill came to $87, a fraction of what she spent on property maintenance in a typical week, but it felt like the most important money she'd spent in months. When she returned to Riverside Commons, carrying boxes of food and a cardboard tray of coffee cups, she found that her father had transformed the lobby into an impromptu community center. He'd somehow located folding chairs from a storage room and arranged them in a circle, encouraging conversation among residents who might otherwise have sat in isolated anxiety. Mrs. Henderson was telling a story about the last time the building had flooded, back in 1987, when a different water main had burst during an unusually cold winter. "We all ended up at the Motel 6 for 3 days, she was saying, her voice stronger now that she was surrounded by neighbors and engaged in familiar social rituals. "But you know what? Some of my best friendships in this building started during those 3 days. There's nothing like shared crisis to bring people together." Her father was nodding along, occasionally adding details or asking questions that kept the story flowing. Sarah recognized the skill from her childhood, the way he could draw people out, make them feel heard and valued, even in difficult circumstances. It was a gift she'd inherited from him, though she'd channeled it into business relationships rather than community building. "Coffee's here," Sarah announced, setting the boxies on a table that her father had somehow procured from the building's community room, "and breakfast sandwiches for anyone who's interested." The response was immediate and grateful. Elderly hands reached for warm coffee cups, and the lobby filled with the comfortable sounds of people sharing food and conversation. Sarah found herself in the strange position of serving coffee to her own father, watching him interact with neighbors whose rent she collected every month. "You're an angel," Mrs. Henderson said, accepting a coffee with hands that shook slightly from age or cold or stress. "I don't know what we would have done without people like you and Robert here organizing everything." The comparison stung and warmed simultaneously. Sarah had provided the resources, the emergency housing, the food, the financial safety net that would cover all expenses. But her father had provided the human connection, the emotional leadership that turned a crisis into a community experience. "It's nothing," Sarah said, meaning it. In the context of her overall financial situation, the money she was spending on this emergency was insignificant. But she was beginning to understand that the impact went beyond dollars and cents, that property ownership came with responsibilities she'd never fully considered. Around 4:30 a.m., the building inspector finally cleared the structure for brief tenant visits to collect essential items. Sarah watched as her father helped organize small groups of residents, making sure everyone had assistance carrying their belongings and that nobody was forgotten in their temporary rooms. As he walked past her toward the elevator, Sarah caught a glimpse of him in profile, the same strong jawline she'd inherited, the same determined set to his shoulders that had carried him through 30 years of physical labor and financial uncertainty. He was wearing mismatched socks and his hair was sticking up in the back, but there was dignity in the way he moved, purpose in his actions that reminded Sarah why she'd loved him so fiercely as a child. The property manager approached her as the residents headed upstairs. "The hotel rooms are all confirmed and I've arranged for a shuttle service to transport anyone who doesn't have their own car. We should have everyone settled within the next 2 hours." "What about ongoing expenses?" Sarah asked. "Food? Transportation? Anything else they need while the repairs are happening?" "I'll set up a system where they can submit receipts for reasonable expenses. Most property owners cap it at $50 per day per person, but you mentioned no limits within reason." Sarah watched her father emerge from the elevator with a small duffel bag and Mrs. Henderson's purse, which he'd apparently offered to carry for her. The gesture was so characteristic, always thinking of others, always ready to take on extra responsibility to make someone else's life a little easier. "Make it $100 per day per person," she said. "And don't make them jump through hoops to get reimbursed. These people have been through enough." The property manager's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. "You're the owner. I'll set it up however you want." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. By 6 a.m., all the displaced residents had been transported to the University Inn, a modest but comfortable hotel that Sarah had chosen specifically because it was close to bus lines and familiar businesses. The lobby of Riverside Commons was finally quiet, filled only with the sound of industrial fans and the occasional footstep of maintenance workers beginning the cleanup process. Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot, emotionally drained from the night's events. She'd managed to help her father and his neighbors through a crisis without revealing her identity, but the experience had shaken her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Seeing her father as a tenant rather than a parent had shifted her perspective on property ownership, making the human costs and responsibilities more tangible than any financial report could convey. Her phone rang, displaying her father's number. For a moment, she considered not answering. What if he'd somehow figured out her identity? But curiosity won out over caution. "Hi, Dad." "Sasha, thank God! I've been trying to reach you for hours. Did you hear what happened at my building?" She felt a stab of guilt in the genuine worry in his voice. "No, what happened?" "Water main break. Flooded half the ground floor. 6 families displaced, including some elderly neighbors I've gotten close to. We're all staying at a hotel while they fix the damage." "Oh my God, are you okay? Do you need anything?" "I'm fine, but I wanted to tell you something. You know how I've always complained about corporate landlords, how they treat tenants like numbers instead of people?" Sarah's stomach clenched. "Yeah?" "Well, whoever owns this building, they've been amazing. Full hotel coverage, meals, transportation, even personal expenses while we're displaced. And there was this young woman who showed up in the middle of the night with coffee and breakfast for everyone. People like that restore your faith in humanity, you know?" The irony was so perfect that Sarah had to press her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. Her father was praising her generosity while having no idea that she was the corporate landlord he'd been criticizing, that his own daughter was the person responsible for both his displacement and his care. "That's wonderful, Dad. I'm glad someone's taking care of you. It makes me think, about how wrong I've been about some things. Maybe there are good people in business, people who care about more than just profit. And, Sasha," his voice softened, "it makes me wonder if I've been too hard on you about your career choices, if there are ways to do business that actually help people." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words and the burden of her secret pressing against her chest like a physical force. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe I've been too focused on traditional ideas about what's appropriate for young women, what's safe and stable. Maybe I haven't given you enough credit for having good judgment about your own life." The admission was everything she'd wanted to hear for years, but receiving it under these circumstances felt hollow and complicated. Her father was learning to respect her ambitions because he'd witnessed anonymous kindness from someone he didn't know as his daughter. The lesson was real, but it was based on an incomplete picture of the truth. "I love you, Dad," she said, meaning it more than she'd ever meant anything. "I love you too, Sasha, and I'm sorry if I haven't always shown it in the right way." After they hung up, Sarah sat in her car until the sun was fully up, watching early morning joggers begin their routes around the neighborhood. In 48 hours, she would sit across from her father at Sunday dinner and reveal the truth about her real estate empire. But now, that conversation would carry additional weight. Not just the vindication she'd been seeking, but the responsibility of living up to the person he'd glimpsed in the darkness of an emergency. The property manager called with an update on the repair timeline. 3 weeks minimum, possibly longer depending on the extent of the water damage to the building's electrical systems. Sarah approved the extended timeline and increased the daily allowance for displaced tenants to $150 per person. Money that would come directly from her profits, reducing her return on investment, but feeling absolutely necessary in light of what she'd witnessed. Over the following days, she found herself checking in with the property management company multiple times daily, monitoring not just the repair progress, but the well-being of her displaced tenants. She arranged for transportation to medical appointments, approved special dietary accommodations, and ensured that Mrs. Henderson's prescription medications were transferred to a pharmacy near the hotel. But it was the daily phone calls with her father that proved most challenging. Each conversation brought updates on the community that had formed among the displaced residents, stories of shared meals and group activities that had transformed their temporary displacement into an unexpected adventure. "Mrs. Henderson taught me to play bridge," he reported on Friday afternoon, "and Mr. Martinez has been showing us pictures from his grandchildren's graduation. It's funny how you can live in the same building with people for years and never really get to know them until something like this forces you together." Sarah found herself genuinely invested in these stories, caring about people she'd only known as names on rent rolls and maintenance requests. The experience was changing her understanding of what it meant to be a property owner, shifting her focus from maximum profitability to sustainable community building. On Saturday morning, she drove to the hotel to observe the repairs firsthand, parking across the street where she could watch the maintenance crews without being seen by any residents who might be coming or going. The work was progressing well. New water lines being installed, damaged flooring being replaced, electrical systems being upgraded to prevent future problems. But what captured her attention was the scene unfolding in the hotel's parking lot where her father was organizing a group grocery run for residents who wanted to prepare their own meals rather than relying on restaurant food. He'd somehow arranged to borrow the hotel's courtesy van and was coordinating schedules to make sure everyone who wanted to participate could join.
Watching him take care of his neighbors with such natural authority and compassion, Sarah felt a complex mixture of pride and regret. This was the father who'd raised her to care about others, to take responsibility for her community. But it was also the father who'd never quite understood that she could channel those same values into business success, that her ambitions were motivated by more than mere profit. In 24 hours, she would finally have the opportunity to show him who she'd become, to bridge the gap between the person he'd raised her to be and the person he'd never quite been able to accept. The revelation would change everything between them. But she was beginning to understand that the change was necessary, not just for her own satisfaction, but for the sake of the relationship they could build on the foundation of truth. The water main break had been an emergency, a crisis that had tested her resources and revealed new dimensions of her responsibilities as a property owner. But it had also been a rehearsal for the much larger revelation that was still to come, a preview of the conversation that would finally bring her two lives, the public and the private, the family and the business, into alignment. Sunday dinner at her parents' apartment had always followed the same ritual. Sarah would arrive at exactly 5 p.m. with a bottle of wine and her mother's favorite dessert from the bakery in Chinatown. They'd spend an hour catching up while her mother finished cooking, and then they'd sit around the small dining table that had served their family for 20 years. But tonight, as Sarah stood outside their door with a manila folder tucked inside her purse alongside the usual offerings, she knew this dinner would shatter the comfortable predictability they'd all come to expect.
Her father answered the door, still wearing the hotel robe from the University Inn, a detail that made Sarah's stomach clench with the weight of secrets about to be revealed. The past week of temporary displacement had taken its toll. He looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, worn down by the disruption to routines that had structured his post-divorce life. "Sasha, come in," he said, pulling her into a hug that smelled like the industrial soap the hotel provided. "I was just telling your mother about our adventure in temporary housing. You wouldn't believe how this crisis brought our whole building community together." Her mother appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel that had been embroidered with "Home Sweet Home" in fading blue thread. Linda Chen had aged gracefully over the past few years. Her black hair now streaked with silver she no longer bothered to cover, but her smile still carried the warmth that had made their house the gathering place for neighborhood children when Sarah was growing up. "How are you holding up with all the displacement?" Sarah asked, accepting her mother's embrace while her mind raced through the choreography of revelations she'd planned for the evening. "Oh, it's been quite an adventure," her mother replied, leading them toward the living room where the familiar sounds and smells of Sunday dinner were already filling the air. "Your father has become the unofficial mayor of our temporary hotel community, organizing group meals, coordinating transportation, making sure the elderly residents are getting proper care." Sarah settled into the same spot on the couch she'd occupied since childhood, a corner position that offered a clear view of both parents and easy access to the coffee table where she'd placed the folder containing property documents, financial statements, and photographs that would transform their understanding of her life. "That's wonderful that you're taking care of your neighbors," she said, meaning it more than her parents could possibly understand. "It sounds like the property owner is being pretty generous with the temporary arrangements." Her father's expression shifted, becoming more animated as he settled into a topic that had clearly been occupying his thoughts. "You know, Sasha, that's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. This whole experience has made me reconsider some of my assumptions about business and property ownership." Sarah's pulse quickened. This was it, the opening she'd been waiting for, the perfect segue into the conversation that would change everything between them.
What kind of assumptions? Well, you remember how I've always been skeptical about real estate investment? How I've said it was a game for people with family money or connections we don't have? Her father leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees in the gesture that always preceded his most serious conversations. "But this week, I've seen what ethical property ownership looks like. Whoever owns our building, they've covered everything. Hotel rooms, meals, transportation, even personal expenses while we're displaced." Her mother nodded from her position in the kitchen doorway. "He's been talking about this all week, haven't you, Robert? About how maybe we've been too quick to judge people in business." "More than that," her father continued, his voice carrying a note of wonder that Sarah hadn't heard in years. "It's made me realize that maybe I've been too narrow in my thinking about your career, about what's appropriate for someone with your intelligence and drive." Sarah felt the moment crystallizing around her like sugar turning to caramel, sweet and irreversible and potentially dangerous if the temperature wasn't just right. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe I've been holding on to outdated ideas about women in business, about the kind of work that's suitable for my daughter. This week, I've been talking to some of the younger residents in our building, graduate students, young professionals, and they all speak so highly of real estate as an investment strategy." The irony was so perfect that Sarah had to press her lips together to keep from smiling. Her father was finally embracing real estate investment based on his experience as her tenant, finally recognizing the value of the career path he'd spent years discouraging. "Actually, Dad, that's something I've been wanting to talk to you about." Sarah reached for the folder in her purse, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out the first document, a property portfolio summary she'd prepared specifically for this conversation. "I think you'll be interested to know that I've been doing some real estate investing myself." Both parents looked at her with sudden attention, their expressions shifting from casual dinner conversation to focused interest. Her mother moved fully into the living room, settling into her favorite armchair with the careful posture of someone preparing to receive important news. "What kind of investing?" her father asked, his voice carrying a mix of curiosity and concern. "Please tell me you haven't been putting money into some online scam or cryptocurrency nonsense."
Sarah laid the first document on the coffee table, a clean, professional summary showing her property portfolio value, monthly rental income, and return on investment percentages. The numbers were staggering enough to command attention, but presented in a way that wouldn't immediately overwhelm. Real estate, Dad. Actual properties, buildings, apartments, commercial spaces. She watched their faces as they processed the information, saw the moment when comprehension began to dawn in her father's eyes. I've been building a portfolio for the past 5 years. Her father picked up the document, his construction-calloused fingers tracing the columns of numbers with the careful attention he'd once given to blueprints and building specifications. Sasha, these numbers. This says you own 17 properties worth over $12 million. That's correct. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications, heavy with the weight of years of misunderstanding finally beginning to collapse. Her mother was staring at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language, while her father's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and the first stirrings of recognition. But where did you get the capital for this kind of investment? Her father's voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the reality he was trying to process. I started small, Dad, really small. A 2-unit building that needed work, in a neighborhood everyone else was avoiding. The duplex in Tacoma, her mother said suddenly, recognition dawning in her voice. 3 years ago, when you said you were thinking about buying something as an investment. We thought you were being foolish, remember, Robert? We tried to talk her out of it. Sarah nodded, remembering that conversation with painful clarity. They'd sat in the same living room while she'd tried to explain her business plan, only to have her father dismiss it as impractical, and her mother worry about the risks to her financial security. You said women like me didn't belong in real estate, Sarah said quietly, the old hurt bleeding through her carefully maintained composure. You said it was a man's game, that I should focus on finding a husband and a stable job. Her father's face crumpled as the weight of his own words came back to him. Oh God, Sasha, I said those things because I was scared for you, because I didn't understand what you were trying to do. I thought I was protecting you from disappointment. I know, Dad, but you were wrong, and I've spent the past 5 years proving it. Sarah laid out the rest of the documents, photographs of her properties, testimonials from satisfied tenants, financial statements showing consistent profitability across her entire portfolio. With each new piece of evidence, her parents' understanding of their daughter's life was being rewritten in real time. This building here, her mother said, pointing to a photograph of a renovated apartment complex in Bellingham. It's beautiful. Did you do all this restoration yourself? I hired contractors, managed the project, coordinated with the city planning department. It was a 6-month renovation that transformed 24 units of substandard housing into affordable, modern apartments for working families. Her father was studying a photograph of another property, his professional eye noting details that a layperson might miss. This is quality work, Sasha, really quality. The architectural details, the landscaping, the attention to infrastructure. This isn't some slumlord operation. No, it's not. Every property in my portfolio meets or exceeds local housing standards. Most of my tenants have been with me for over a year, and I maintain a 94% occupancy rate. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and Sarah saw her father recognize it as the same pride he felt when discussing a well-built house or a construction project completed ahead of schedule and under budget. For the first time in years, they were speaking the same language, the language of craftsmanship, quality, and professional accomplishment. But the biggest revelation was still to come, and Sarah knew she couldn't delay it any longer. She pulled out the final document, the ownership papers for Riverside Commons, complete with the property address that her father would recognize immediately. There's something else, Dad. Something I need to tell you about your building. She placed the document on the coffee table, watching as her father's eyes moved from her face to the paper and back again. The address was clearly visible, 4247 University Way, Ani, the same address he'd been calling home for the past 3 years. I don't understand, he said slowly, but she could see in his expression that understanding was beginning to dawn like sunrise over water.
Yes. And all those improvements you've been noticing? The new landscaping, the updated security system, the hallway lighting. I approved and funded all of that. The water main that broke last week? I arranged for all the emergency housing and expenses. That young woman who brought coffee to everyone in the middle of the night? That was me. Her father stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if the daughter he thought he knew had been replaced by someone entirely different, yet somehow familiar. You were there, at the building. You brought us coffee and breakfast. I was there. But you didn't... Why didn't you tell me who you were? Sarah felt tears threatening at the edges of her vision as she tried to articulate feelings she'd been carrying for 3 years. Because I wanted you to see who I really am before you knew I was your daughter. I wanted you to witness the kind of property owner I've become, the way I treat tenants, the decisions I make when no one's watching. Her mother was crying openly now, her hands pressed to her mouth as she absorbed the magnitude of what her daughter had accomplished and the elaborate deception she had maintained to protect her secret. "The rent checks?" her father said wonderfully. "Every month I've been writing rent checks that go to you?" Every month. And the complaints I've made about corporate landlords? About people who don't care about their tenants? Sarah nodded. "I've heard every one of them, and I've tried to be better because of them. Your criticisms made me a more ethical property owner." Her father stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the parking lot of his own temporary displacement. When he turned back to face her, his expression had shifted into something Sarah had never seen before, a mixture of awe, regret, and paternal pride so intense it seemed to transform his entire bearing. 18 months, he said. For 18 months, you've been taking care of me without me knowing it, making improvements to my home, keeping my rent below market rate, ensuring I had good neighbors and safe living conditions. "Mrs. Henderson's rent is $200 below market rate," Sarah said quietly. "I know you care about her, so I made sure she could afford to stay." The admission broke something loose in her father's composure. He sat down heavily, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with emotion that seemed too large for his body to contain. "Oh God, Sasha, what have I done? All these years, I've been telling you that you didn't have what it takes to succeed in business, that real estate was beyond your capabilities, and you've been taking care of me this whole time." Sarah moved to sit beside him on the couch, the same couch where she'd curled up as a child to watch movies with her parents, where they had countless conversations about her future that had always ended with her feeling misunderstood and limited by their expectations. "Dad, you weren't entirely wrong. Real estate is complicated, and there were times when I made mistakes, when I questioned whether I was in over my head. But I kept going because I had to prove to myself that I could do it, that the dreams you called impractical were actually achievable." Her father looked up at her, his eyes red with unshed tears and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "But why didn't you tell us? Why keep it secret for so long?" The question Sarah had been dreading and preparing for simultaneously. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully because she knew this moment would define their relationship going forward. "Because I needed you to see my work before you knew it was mine. I needed you to experience what ethical property ownership looked like, to understand that business success and caring for people aren't mutually exclusive. If I told you from the beginning, you would have seen my purchases as reckless risk-taking rather than calculated investments." Her mother, who had been silently absorbing the conversation, finally spoke up. "She's right, Robert. Remember how we reacted when she bought that first duplex? We were so afraid she was making a mistake that we couldn't see the planning and research she'd put into it." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward her mother, who had always been the family mediator, the one who could help her father see perspectives he might otherwise miss. "And there's something else," Sarah continued, pulling out one final document,
a business plan she'd prepared for her parents' potential involvement in her next acquisition. Dad, remember earlier this week when you asked me about real estate investment? About whether it might be something you and Mom could consider? Her father nodded mutely. I've been working on a proposal, a way for you to become a partner in my next property acquisition. Not as a favor or charity, but as genuine business partners. She handed him the document, watching as his eyes moved over projections and timelines that represented months of planning. There's a 12-unit apartment building in Spokane that I've been analyzing. The numbers work, the location is solid, and it would benefit from having a partner with construction expertise. The offer hung in the air between them, representing not just a business opportunity, but a chance to transform their relationship from one based on dependence and criticism to one founded on mutual respect and shared goals. Her father studied the proposal with the same attention he'd once given to building plans, his professional eye evaluating the feasibility and potential returns. These projections look solid, conservative but realistic. And the renovation timeline, this is the kind of work I've been doing for 30 years. I know, that's why I want you as a partner. Not because you're my father, but because you're the best contractor I know. The admission seemed to unlock something in her father's expression, a recognition that his daughter wasn't offering him charity, but genuine partnership based on his skills and experience. For the first time in their conversation, he looked at her not as his little girl, but as a peer, a fellow professional worthy of his respect. There's something else I need to say, he said, setting the business proposal aside and turning to face her directly. Something I should have said years ago. Sarah braced herself for whatever was coming, uncertain whether it would be apology or criticism or something else entirely. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all the years I made you feel like your dreams were too big, like you didn't have what it takes to succeed in business. I was wrong, and my being wrong cost us both valuable time. The apology she'd wanted for years finally arriving, but in a context that made it more meaningful than she'd ever imagined. Her father wasn't just apologizing for his words, he was acknowledging the success she'd built despite his lack of support, recognizing the woman she'd become in spite of his limitations. I accept your apology, Dad, but I need you to understand something else. Sarah reached across the coffee table and picked up a photograph of Riverside Commons, the building where her father had unknowingly been her tenant for 3 years. When I bought your building, part of me was motivated by anger. I wanted to prove you wrong, to show you that I could succeed in exactly the field you told me to avoid. Her father nodded, his expression accepting the complexity of her motivations without judgment. But that changed after the first few months. Taking care of you and Mrs. Henderson and all the other residents, it stopped being about proving a point and started being about creating the kind of housing community I'd want to live in myself. You taught me to care about people, Dad.
Even when you doubted my career choices, you never doubted that I should treat others with dignity and respect. Her mother wiped her eyes with the embroidered dish towel, her voice thick with emotion when she spoke. So, when you were bringing coffee to everyone during the flood, you were taking care of your father without him knowing it was you. Yes, and watching him take care of his neighbors, organize support for the elderly residents, make sure everyone felt included, that was the father I remembered from childhood. The man who taught me that success means nothing if you don't use it to help others. Her father was quiet for several long moments, absorbing the full weight of what his daughter had revealed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of wonder that made Sarah's chest tight with emotion. You've been the landlord I've been praising all week. When I told you about the generous owner who covered all our expenses, who made sure we were comfortable during the displacement, I was talking about you. You were talking about me. And when I said that experience had changed my mind about women in business, about your career choices, Sarah nodded. You were reacting to my work without knowing it was mine.
The circular perfection of the revelation seemed to dawn on all three of them simultaneously. Sarah's elaborate deception had created a situation where her father's praise and criticism were both authentically felt and completely unknowing. He'd experienced her competence and generosity as a property owner while remaining unaware that he was evaluating his own daughter's professional capabilities. Her mother stood up from her chair and moved toward the kitchen, pausing to squeeze Sarah's shoulder as she passed. "I need to check on dinner, but first I want to say something." She looked at her daughter with an expression of maternal pride so intense it seemed to fill the room. "What you've accomplished is extraordinary. Not just the financial success, but the way you've chosen to use it. You've become the kind of person your father and I always hoped you would be." After her mother left for the kitchen, Sarah and her father sat in comfortable silence, both processing the magnitude of what had been revealed and what it meant for their relationship going forward. The evening light streaming through the apartment windows cast long shadows across the coffee table, covered with property documents and business plans that represented years of secret work and hidden accomplishments. "Can I ask you something?" her father said. "Anything. The rent increases that are coming next month. You're implementing those?" Sarah felt a flicker of anxiety about his reaction to this particular detail. "Yes. The increases are all within legal limits and still below market rate for comparable properties. The building improvements and infrastructure upgrades require additional income to maintain profitability." Her father nodded slowly. "I'm not complaining about the increase. I'm asking because I want to understand how you make these decisions. How do you balance being profitable with being fair to tenants who might struggle with higher costs?" The question revealed a depth of interest that went beyond personal concern. Her father was genuinely curious about the business logic behind property management decisions, approaching her work with the same analytical mindset he brought to construction projects. "It's one of the most challenging aspects of property ownership," Sarah admitted. "Every rent increase affects real people with real budgets. That's why I research comparable properties extensively, why I invest in improvements that justify the increases, and why I sometimes accept below-market rates for long-term tenants who contribute positively to the building community, like Mrs. Henderson."
Like Mrs. Henderson, and like you, actually. Your rent has been $150 below market rate for the past year because I know you're on a fixed budget and you've been a model tenant. Her father's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You've been subsidizing my housing?" "I've been investing in my building's community. Tenants like you and Mrs. Henderson create stability and positive relationships that benefit everyone in the property. That has monetary value, even if it doesn't show up directly in the rent roll." The conversation was interrupted by her mother calling from the kitchen that dinner was ready, but Sarah could see that her father was processing this information with the kind of professional respect he'd never before applied to her career choices. For the first time in years, they were discussing her work as equals, with him asking questions born of genuine interest, rather than skeptical concern. Dinner conversation continued the theme of revelation and adjustment, with her parents asking detailed questions about property management, tenant relations, and long-term investment strategy. Her father was particularly interested in the construction and renovation aspects of her business, while her mother wanted to understand the human side, how Sarah balanced profit motives with social responsibility. "What I don't understand," her mother said over the dessert Sarah had brought from Chinatown, "is how you managed to keep this secret for so long. The financial records, the property visits, the business meetings. How did you hide all of that while still maintaining a relationship with us?" Sarah had anticipated this question, but answering it required revealing another layer of the elaborate life she'd constructed to maintain her anonymity. "I've been living essentially two separate lives. The daughter you know, who rents an apartment in Queen Anne and works in commercial real estate, and Sarah Chen, the property investor, who owns 17 buildings and manages a portfolio worth over $12 million. That must have been exhausting," her father said, his voice carrying a note of concern that touched Sarah more than she'd expected.
It was, especially during family gatherings when you'd ask about my career plans or suggest I find something more stable. I wanted so badly to tell you what I'd accomplished, but I was afraid you'd see it as reckless rather than strategic. Were we really that unsupportive? Her mother asked, her voice small with regret. I considered the question carefully, wanting to be honest without being hurtful. You were protective, maybe overprotective, but I understand why. You came to this country with nothing, built a stable life through hard work and careful choices. My ambitions probably seemed dangerous compared to the security you'd worked so hard to achieve. Her father nodded slowly. That's exactly right. Everything we did, every decision we made, was about creating stability for you and your future children. The idea of you taking on debt, managing property, dealing with tenants, it seemed like unnecessary risk when you could have a steady job with benefits and retirement savings. But what I've built has more security than any job could ever provide, Sarah said gently. My properties generate enough passive income to support me even if I never worked another day. That's a different kind of stability, but it's real. The conversation continued long past their usual Sunday dinner timeline, with Sarah showing her parents additional photographs of her properties and explaining the business logic behind each acquisition. Her father was particularly impressed by her renovation projects, recognizing the quality of workmanship and the attention to detail that transformed aging buildings into desirable housing. This property in Bellingham, he said, studying before and after photos of a complex renovation. This is beautiful work. Who did you use for the construction management? Morrison Construction for the structural work, Pacific Northwest Electrical for the upgrades, and I coordinated directly with the subcontractors for interior finishing. Her father's eyebrows rose. You managed a project this size yourself?
With help from experienced contractors. But yes, I was on site most days during the renovation, making decisions and ensuring quality control. The admission seemed to shift something fundamental in her father's understanding of her capabilities. Sarah recognized the moment when his perception of her transformed from daughter trying to make it in a difficult industry to experienced professional who knows her business. That's impressive project management, he said, and Sarah heard professional respect in his voice that had never been there before. Coordinating multiple contractors, staying on budget and timeline, that's not easy even for people with decades of experience. As the evening wound down and Sarah prepared to leave, her father walked her to the door with the business proposal she'd prepared for their potential partnership. I want to study this more carefully, he said, but I'm genuinely interested in working together on the Spokane property. Take your time. This would be a real partnership, Dad. Equal investment, shared decision-making, profit split based on contribution. I'm not offering you charity. I understand. And Sasha? He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to the moment. What you've accomplished is remarkable. Not just the financial success, but the integrity you've brought to it. You've proven that business success and caring for people aren't mutually exclusive. Sarah felt tears threatening again, but they were different tears now. Relief and joy, rather than the frustration and hurt that had characterized so many of their previous conversations about her career. Thank you for finally saying that. I should have said it years ago. I should have trusted you to know your own mind, your own capabilities. As Sarah drove home through the Seattle evening, her mind was already racing ahead to the practical implications of what had just occurred. The secret she'd maintained for 3 years was finally out, but that revelation had created new opportunities and challenges that would reshape her relationship with her parents going forward. Her phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. How did the family dinner go? Sarah smiled as she typed back. They know everything now, and Dad wants to become a business partner. Margaret's response came quickly. Congratulations, dear. The truth was always going to come out eventually. Better to control the timing yourself. But as Sarah pulled into her apartment building's parking garage, she realized that Margaret was only partially right. The truth had come out, but it had done so in a way that exceeded her most optimistic expectations.
Her father hadn't just accepted her success. He'd been unknowingly benefiting from it for months, experiencing firsthand the kind of ethical property owner she'd chosen to become. The elaborate deception had been exhausting to maintain, but it had also created the perfect conditions for her father's transformation from skeptical critic to potential business partner. By experiencing her competence and generosity as a tenant before learning she was his daughter, he'd been forced to confront his own assumptions about women in business and his daughter's capabilities. Tomorrow, Sarah would call her property management company and inform them that her identity was no longer confidential with regard to Riverside Commons. She would also begin working through the details of the Spokane partnership with her father, transforming their relationship from parent-child dynamics to professional collaboration based on mutual respect and shared expertise. But tonight, she allowed herself to savor the sweet satisfaction of vindication earned through years of patient work and strategic revelation. Her father's praise of her property management, delivered unknowingly but authentically, had been worth every month of secrecy and every carefully maintained deception.
The girl who'd been told that women like her didn't belong in real estate had become the property owner whose ethics and generosity had changed her father's mind about women in business. The circular perfection of that outcome felt like poetry, like justice, like the best possible ending to a story that had taken 3 years to unfold. What happens when a daughter's hidden success becomes the foundation for healing a fractured relationship with her father? This compelling story follows Sarah Chen, a young woman who built a multi-million-dollar real estate empire in secret, only to discover that her greatest achievement wouldn't be financial, it would be transforming her relationship with the father who never believed in her dreams. Sarah's journey started with secrecy born from necessity. As a young professional with ambitious plans to invest in real estate, she faced constant criticism from her traditional father, Robert Chen, a construction contractor who viewed his daughter's business aspirations as risky and inappropriate. Rather than abandon her dreams, Sarah chose a different path. She would prove herself first, then reveal her success. Working quietly behind the scenes, Sarah built an impressive portfolio of rental properties throughout Seattle. She renovated buildings, managed tenants, and grew her wealth, all while maintaining the facade of a regular employee to avoid her father's disapproval. Her empire included everything from small apartment buildings to the very building where her father lived as a tenant, completely unaware that his own daughter was his landlord. The turning point came during a family dinner when Sarah could no longer bear the weight of her secret. In a moment of courage and frustration, she revealed the truth about her business success to her shocked parents. The revelation that their irresponsible daughter owned millions of dollars in real estate, including their own home, forced everyone to confront years of misunderstanding and missed communication. Robert Chen's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by a complex mixture of pride, regret, and shame. He had spent years criticizing his daughter's ambitions, not realizing she had already achieved more than he had ever dreamed possible in his own construction career. What could have been a permanent rift became an opportunity for healing. When a flood damaged one of Sarah's properties, her father stepped in to help coordinate repairs and support displaced tenants. Working together for the first time, they discovered that their skills complemented each other perfectly. His construction expertise combined with her business acumen and financing capabilities. This collaboration evolved into something neither had expected, a genuine business partnership. Sarah invited her father to join her in renovating a 12-unit apartment building in Spokane, marking the beginning of Chen Properties. For Robert, it represented a chance to pursue the property development dreams he had abandoned decades earlier due to fear and limited opportunities as an immigrant. Under their partnership, Chen Properties grew beyond mere wealth accumulation into a model for ethical real estate development. They pioneered innovative approaches to affordable housing, creating communities that prioritize tenant welfare alongside profitability.
Their projects featured sustainable construction, fair rents, and designs that encouraged community building among residents. The story spans a decade, showing how Sarah's secret empire transformed into something far more valuable, a platform for family reconciliation and community impact. Their developments housed teachers, nurses, firefighters, and other working-class families who had been priced out of Seattle's expensive housing market. What makes this story particularly compelling is how Sarah's business success became a vehicle for deeper personal growth. She evolved from someone who hid her achievements to someone who celebrated them within the context of community service. Her properties weren't just investments, they became homes where residents like elderly librarian Mrs. Henderson found community and belonging. The father-daughter relationship that began with criticism and secrecy developed into mutual respect and shared purpose. Robert Chen discovered that his daughter's business instincts
Were not only sound, but ethically grounded, while Sarah learned that her father's initial skepticism stemmed from his own unfulfilled dreams and immigrant experiences. By the story's end, Chen Properties had become a nationally recognized leader in sustainable community development. Their success proved that ethical business practices and financial returns could coexist, inspiring other developers to adopt similar community-focused approaches. The transformation was complete when Sarah's wedding reception was held in one of their community centers, surrounded by the tenants and neighbors whose lives had been touched by their work. From a secret empire built in isolation, Sarah had created a legacy of community, family healing, and ethical business practices. This story resonates because it addresses universal themes: the desire for parental approval, the courage required to pursue unconventional dreams, and the power of honest communication to heal relationships. It shows how business success becomes truly meaningful when it serves purposes larger than individual wealth accumulation. Sarah's journey from secret real estate mogul to community developer illustrates that our greatest achievements often come not from proving others wrong, but from finding ways to build bridges and create opportunities for others to succeed alongside us. If you enjoyed this story of family, business, and community building, please subscribe to hear more inspiring tales of transformation and success. Don't miss future stories that explore how personal growth and ethical business practices can change not just individual lives, but entire communities.